In a quiet and forgotten corner of Montana, there is an old road that has long been abandoned. It leads through forests and mountains, tiny villages, and deserted fields. Locals try to avoid her by telling scary stories about mysterious disappearances and unexplained events that happened along the way. One day, a group of urban researchers, passionate about searching for abandoned places and mysterious incidents, decided to go on this road. Their goal was clear: find the place where a major accident occurred more than 10 years ago, which claimed the lives of several people. According to rumors, this accident was not ordinary. Those who tried to investigate it encountered unexplained phenomena and disappeared without a trace. The team consisted of 6 people: Alex, Kate, Matt, Julia, Rick, and Amy. Armed with the latest cameras, GPS devices, and flashlights, they set off, leaving their cars at the beginning of the road. For the first few hours, they walked along the trail, studying the old crooked signs and fallen trees that completely blocked the passage. When they reached the supposed crash site, they found only the wreckage of wrecked cars and a few old, time-worn road signs. All these years, the place has been abandoned and covered with a thick layer of dust and debris. They decided to spend the night at the site to explore it more thoroughly. Having set up camp in a small clearing near the wreckage, the researchers began to set up tents and made a bonfire. While Alex and Rick were exploring the surrounding area, Kate, Julia, and Amy prepared recording equipment and mounted cameras on tripods to capture everything that was happening at night. Matt was setting up GPS devices and checking communication with the outside world. As it got dark, the forest around them began to seem even more menacing. There was no wind. The trees creaked and swayed strangely, as if something invisible was passing between them. Alex, recording his observations on the camera, noticed that strange light spots periodically appear in the frame, which disappear as suddenly as they appear. Soon, Kate noticed a whisper coming from the depths of the forest. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the sounds were too clear and sounded like human voices. She called out to the others, and they all began to listen. The sounds grew louder and closer, but no one could identify their source. The whispers became more and more distinct, and it seemed that the voices echoed among themselves. Kate turned to the others, face white with fear. Alex tried to make out something in the dark by pointing the flashlight beam deep into the forest. The beam of light only accentuated the gloom that seemed to surround them. "We have to get out of here," Julia whispered, clutching the camera with trembling hands. But before anyone could answer, suddenly it became terribly cold in the clearing. The air around them seemed to freeze, and the silence was broken only by their heavy breathing and the soft rustle of leaves. Alex noticed that one of the wreckage of the car was starting to vibrate strangely. He came closer to examine it, and at that moment he heard a scream. Amy, who was standing closest to the forest, suddenly disappeared into the shadows of the trees. Everyone rushed to the place where she was standing, but her tracks stopped at the very trees. The screams continued to come from somewhere deep in the forest, but no matter where they pointed their lanterns, they couldn't see anything. "Let's split up and look for her," Rick suggested, but there was panic in his voice. Alex, Rick, and Matt went in one direction, Kate and Julia in the other. Every step in the dark was accompanied by strange sounds, as if someone was walking next to them. Suddenly, Alex felt the ground begin to shake under his feet. He shone the flashlight down and saw that the soil seemed to boil, as if something was trying to break out. Meanwhile, Kate and Julia stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin that they hadn't noticed before. The door was ajar, and a faint light was coming out. As they got closer, they heard a heartbeat and a quiet cry. Once inside, they found Amy sitting in a corner with her arms wrapped around her knees. Her face was covered with dirt and scratches, and her eyes were full of horror. "We need to leave," he whispered. "This place is cursed." At that moment, the walls of the hut began to shake, and dust fell from the ceiling. Kate and Julia helped Amy up, and they ran out of the hut, returning to the camp. When they reached the clearing, they saw that the camp had been destroyed. Tents were torn to shreds, and the cameras were lying on the ground, broken. They stood in horror, looking at the devastated camp. Alex, Rick, and Matt ran up to them after seeing their panicked faces. No one understood what could have happened in such a short time, and who or what could have done it. Suddenly, all the lanterns started flashing and going out one by one, leaving the group in total darkness. Whispers began to ring out around them again, but now they sounded like malicious taunts. Ghostly figures began to appear out of the darkness, their faces distorted in eerie grimaces. One of the figures came closer, and Rick, full of horror, tried to throw it away, but his hand went through the void. Figure began to change shape, becoming more and more real and tangible. Suddenly she grabbed Rick's arm, and he screamed in pain. The others tried to help, but their own bodies seemed paralyzed by fear. The ground beneath his feet began to shake again, and his hands, covered with dirt and blood, began to make their way out from under it. They grabbed his legs, pulled him down, and each of them felt himself being pulled by force to the ground. Matt screamed, trying to pull away, but his feet were already half sunk into the ground. Kate and Julia grabbed rocks and branches in a panic, trying to fight back. Their efforts were useless. Suddenly, the hut they had just run out of began to emit a bright light, and a figure resembling an accident victim crawled out of its doors. Her eyes were empty, and her mouth was making a soundless scream. Amy, desperately trying to save her friends, ran to the hut, hoping that the light from there could protect them. But as soon as she got closer, her body seemed to be pulled inside. He disappeared as quickly as she appeared. Alex, realizing that their chances of escape were minimal, gathered all his will into a fist and rushed to the hut, shouting for the others to follow him. But before he reached it, figures around him closed in. Their hands began to strangle him, preventing him from breathing. Tried to resist, but his strength quickly ran out. At the last moment, when Alex was almost losing consciousness, he saw Matt and Rick, still fighting for their lives, being dragged underground, their screams echoing through the forest. Kate and Julia, broken and exhausted, could no longer resist and fell to the ground. Kate and Julia were lying on the ground. They feel their bodies being pulled into the damp soil. Fog was thickening all around them, as if it was suffocating them. Suddenly, the light from the hut became brighter, and the figures that had been tormenting their friends began to move towards her. Alex, barely able to stand, gathered his last strength and tried to reach Julia. Did not have time. Her body had already almost completely disappeared into the ground, and a hoarse cry of despair was coming out of her mouth. That moment, ominous laughter rang out from the hut, and another figure crawled out of the door, dragging chains behind him. She slowly approached the survivors, her eyes burning with hatred and a thirst for revenge. Kate, full of terror, tried to crawl away, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. The figure reached Kate and began to wrap her in chains, each link of which responded with pain and cold. She pulled her towards the hut, and Kate screamed and struggled, but her strength was quickly running out. Alex, gathering his last strength, rushed to help, but he was stopped by an invisible barrier, from which he bounced off as if from a wall. Suddenly, a loud roar was heard from the darkness, and the ground began to open up under his feet. Ominous lights were shooting out of the crevices, and the figures became even more aggressive. They began to circle around Alex, and he realized this was the end. The hut, which had been glowing before, now became a source of darkness. Shadows began to come out of its windows and doors, becoming more and more dense. They surrounded the camp, and Alex, Kate, and Julia found themselves in the middle of this nightmare. Suddenly, the figure of a woman stepped out of the shadows, her face twisted in a terrible grimace of pain and rage. She went up to Alex and whispered, "You have disturbed our peace. Now your soul will stay here forever." Kate and Julia, almost completely engulfed by the soil, were emitting their last fury and despair. Their screams faded as their bodies finally disappeared underground. Alex, trying to find some way to save his friends, found himself face to face with a ghostly figure dragging chains. His own strength was running out, and every step towards the hut only increased his sense of terror. When another scream appeared out of the fog and darkness, Alex noticed that the chains around Kate began to disappear into thin air. He gathered his last strength and crawled to the hut. Suddenly, one of the chain ghosts grabbed him, but at that moment, Alex noticed that his hands began to melt in the air, as if he was a ghost approaching his fate. Just like Kate, a ghostly figure began to rise into the air, pulling Alex with it. He was able to break free, but only for a moment. While the figures in the hut continued to dance endlessly in their torment, distorted faces, trembling with pain and anger, looked at him. At this moment, in the depths of the forest, where it seemed that everything was covered with darkness and fear, two silhouettes were visible. It was Rick and Amy, who, caught in the thick of the fog and darkness, were fighting for their lives. Rick, trembling and with a burned face, held Amy's hand, trying to pull her out of the fog. They found shelter by a small light source that looked like a tiny but bright light shining in absolute darkness. Rick and Amy, realizing that they were the last survivors, began to look for a way to leave this terrible place. In their condition, not finding any other way, they decided to look for a way out of the forest. Suddenly, Rick pulled Amy to him and, gasping, whispered, "We have to get out of here. This place won't let us live."